My name is Meseret. I will also introduce further myself. This African Presidential Scholar Program is a very important program, which is funded by the African Studies Center of Michigan University, and it gives us a greater opportunity for more than 160 scholars from African countries, including Ethiopia, South Africa, Ghana, and others. And this is creating an important and a significant impact for African higher education, especially by contributing that doing research in the American context and sharing experiences between American Michigan universities, mentors, and also among us. And as scholars coming here, we have also an opportunity to work in the future in the collaborative research and project works, and that's also one of the most important points I wanted to mention.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Philile Mbatha, and I'm from the University of Cape Town. I work as faculty there in the School of Environmental and Geographical Science, and my research basically focuses on marine resources. So I focus on the Western Indian Ocean region of Africa, and mostly in Southern Africa. So I've worked in places such as South Africa and Mozambique mostly, but then I've also worked in south of India as well as Sri Lanka. And just a bit of a background about myself. So I was born in Durban, which is on the east coast of South Africa, where the Indian Ocean is, which is why I have an interest on the marine environments, especially on that side. And South Africa is a very unique country in the sense that it borders two oceans. So on the east side, we have the Indian Ocean, and on the west side, where I now live in Cape Town, we have the Atlantic Ocean. So I don't do as much research on that side. So the Indian Ocean has a warmer current and warmer beaches. It's really nice. And then the Atlantic Ocean side, which is where Cape Town is, has more of a cooler current. So it's much colder there. So yes, so I was born in Durban, and then I moved to Cape Town to do my master's and then my PhD. And then I now work there as a member of faculty. So as I said, my research focuses on marine and coastal environments. So I'm particularly interested on rural contexts along the coast. So I don't just focus on any marine coastal areas, but I focus on rural ones. And the reason why that is because South Africa is 60% rural, which is basically the majority of our landscape. But a lot of research that happens within environmental and geographical fields focuses a lot on urban areas, but not so much on the rural. So I'm more passionate about understanding about rural context because there's a lot happening there, especially along the coast. In the areas where I work on the coast, in rural areas, you find that there are conservation interventions that are present. You also have a lot of tourism because those areas are very biodiverse. They attract a lot of tourists, especially from Europe and the US. And then you also have fisheries activities, so you have small-scale fisheries as well as industrial fisheries. There's a lot of mining happening along the coast as well, which is titanium mining, which is a mineral that is found in the Western Indian Ocean side of South Africa and Mozambique. And there are others like agriculture, which I won't be talking about today. However, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. We have the highest Gini coefficients when it comes to inequality. So you have some of the world's richest people that live in South Africa, and some of the world's poorest people are also found in South Africa. And those disparities create a lot of inequalities in terms of how people can access natural resources in sectors such as conservation, tourism, fisheries. So we find that a lot of powerful people, including the government and the wealthy, tend to control benefits coming from these activities. But on paper, they always say that, oh, we want to benefit everyone. But in reality, that never really happens. So we have a big problem in the sense that we have really good policies and laws. Our constitution is one of the most progressive in the world. But when it comes to implementation, there's a huge gap. So what we say doesn't match what's happening in reality. So a lot of poor people are actually getting poorer, and it's not improving. And a lot of people outside of South Africa think that when South Africa became a democracy in 1994, when Nelson Mandela took over, that South Africa is now a great place to live, but it's not necessarily the case. So these are some of the issues that I've outlined as some of the key issues affecting the environment in South Africa. So South Africa is very biodiverse. We have a lot of natural resources, and we also have a lot of mineral resources. So I wouldn't say the problem is necessarily the availability of resources. It's more around the access to resources and who controls how resources are accessed, and also how benefits from resources are distributed. So as I said, there are a lot of inequalities. So what we also find in rural areas is that there are multiple legal or governance orders that exist. So there are many different government departments that you find. So there's a lot of, our government works a lot in silos. So different government departments, for instance, if you look at fisheries, you have departments of fisheries, departments of environment, departments of rural development. All of those could be working in the same area, but they don't communicate, and that creates problems when it comes to conservation. Lack of redress of historical injustices. So as I mentioned, that we have a lot of inequalities. A lot of them come from our history, which is apartheid, which I can talk about later, and also the colonial era that came before that. So a lot of that hasn't changed. So the remnants of those regimes are still experienced by a lot of poor people in South Africa. So governance is a big issue. We don't have a lot of capacity to implement what we say we want to do. Corruption is a big issue. In our governments, there's lack of accountability. So no one checks whether people are doing what they say they are doing, especially when it comes to institutions that are implementing conservation and other services. And as I've said, mismatches and gaps between stated laws and realities on the ground. I think I'll just stop here because the next slide was going to talk about the area that I'm working in, but I maybe it will come up because I saw there's one question that was asking about customary rights or something like that. So maybe I will go to this case study a bit later on.
My name is Meseret Desta, and I'm working here as an African Presidential Scholar with Professor Rebecca Harkin in the School of Environment and Sustainability. Basically, I'm working on this agroforestry, especially on the participation of women in agroforestry practice. And let me give a brief background about me, and later on we will come to the discussions. As a personal background, my birthplace is a small village in Maitamak, where I also work on this research activity. And this is my birthplace at the same time my study area. And Ethiopia is found in East Africa, and my watershed is found also in the northwestern part of Ethiopia, known as Amara region. And this creates for me that a big opportunity to know the area and study more about the agroforestry practice in the watershed area. And I was born from my family's here, my mother and my father, and they are old families and parents. I'm very happy because they are role models of mine, and I learned a lot from them as well. And I'm married with a husband who is alone now. And I also, of course, I have also two nieces. The water in the watershed area, I'm attracted on this practice of agroforestry because they are most important livelihoods of the watershed people where I am growing, and that through time they are improving that practices by themselves. They are not introduced, they are traditional agroforestry practices, but farmers are improving throughout the time. And I'm attracted when I did my PhD to work on this agroforestry practice in that area. So far the educational background is concerned. I learned that in different places from primary education to high school, basically because of the background I had to the moving family, and my father was moving in different areas. I did my bachelor degree in Hayal University, where I started my elementary school as well. And I did my master's degree in Addis Ababa University. Which is in Ethiopia, and I did my PhD in natural resource and life sciences at Boku, which is found in Vienna, Austria, in 2015. Here is my PhD work, where I defended my PhD thesis, and there are also theses are really a professor who helped me to have my PhD and to be successful. And I graduated in this university with a great distinction of excellent PhD dissertation. And after 2 years of my PhD, I am also working as a vice president for business and development in the University of Gondar since 2017. And both leadership as well as academia is a very big challenge for me. And that's why I came here also to stay in academia and to study. So these are some of the publications I had in different proceedings as well as international journals. They are basically from a social science perspective, green infrastructure perspective, as well as agroforestry by itself in different areas we had. So this is. So these are some of the publications are here, and that public lectures and presentations are also in these are conference participations and the proceedings where I contributed for them, and some of the certificates I had, you can go down. There are as many certificates in the training as well as a recognition. And in 2018, I was one of the best instructor as well as a researcher from the College of Social Science and Humanity. Thank you so much for listening. This is a background is a non-agroforestry practice and during the data collection period.
My name is Hayal Desta. I am the 2019 UMAPS scholar, and I am from the Addis Ababa University of Ethiopia. And this is my email address for future communication. And as far as my background is concerned, I am married and with 2 children. And the first one is boy, and the second one is girl. As you have seen, she is studying on the table. And professionally, my wife is the biologist as well as the pharmacist. But now she is now working in the pharmacy. She is now head of the pharmacy. And as far as my educational background is concerned, I studied my PhD in biology and my second degree in environmental science, and my PhD is in environmental planning from Addis Ababa University, as well as from the 2 universities in Germany, University of Hanover and University of Bonn. Yeah, I was in Germany in the University of Ludwig Maximilian University. And as far as my current career is concerned, I am the assistant professor in the Addis Ababa University in the chair of ecosystem planning and management. And this is one of the oldest university in Africa. I think it is one of the leading universities in Africa because it has been established since 1940s, around that. And in this university, I have 2 main tasks as teaching and research. And I've been entitled to carry out 75% of my role in teaching, and the remaining 25% is for research. And as far as my inspiration towards this career is concerned, my late Professor Philile Mbatha, who died 3 years ago, was one of my best professor who inspired me to become my current career. He was the taxonomist as well as a biologist in Addis Ababa University. He was a nice guy. And I did different researches in previously, and I've indicated here some of the selected research. So that all of this, I've selected this because they are done in one particular areas of Ethiopia, the Lake Ziway, and I've published 2 of them in Elsevier Journalists, and one in the Springer, and the other ones in the Will, Lakes and Reservoirs are in the Will. And therefore, all these publications are focusing in one particular area, Lake Ziway, and I'm still continuing my research in this area. And therefore, my current research project is the integrated assessment of ecosystem services, livelihood dependency, and anthropogenic pressures on Lake Ziway, the same lake. And I'm working with Professor Larissa Larson in the University of Michigan in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. And this study area is found within the Ethiopian Rift Valley areas. As you know, Africa, especially the eastern part and the southern part of Africa, has been divided by the Great Rift Valley regions, and therefore the Great Rift Valley regions crosses Ethiopia, and those areas have different lakes of freshwater as well as saline lakes. And one of the lakes in this Rift Valley region is Lake Ziway, which I'm now focusing on. And as far as the watershed area of this lake is concerned, it covers about 7,300 square kilometers of watershed area. And within this watershed area, there are about 2 million people as inhabitants, and whose base, livelihood means is the rainfed agriculture and irrigation in the lake area. And as far as the surface area of this lake is concerned, it is not such a big one. It is about 424 square kilometer area, and its shoreline length is about 137 kilometer area, and the lake is filled by two major rivers, Maki and Qatar River, the one that flows from northeast direction and from the north-south to eastern directions. And this lake is located within the Rift Valley regions. It is about at an elevation of about 1,600 meters above sea level. And so why I choose Lake Ziway for my study? And it has two basic significances. One is ecological significances, and the other one is economic ones. As far as the ecological significance of this lake is concerned, then it supports a variety of wildlife, like different species of birds, like water-dependent or some others, and it also supports hippos, different species of fishes and reptiles. On top of that, as you have seen on the slides, the area, especially the wetland areas around the lake, is serving as a grazing area for a number of cattle to which the local communities are based for their livelihoods on top of the irrigation wells. Next, please. And with respect to the economic significances, and the water of this lake is a freshwater lake, so that investment projects are coming in that area in need of the fresh water, so that the area supports, especially in the vicinity of the Lake Ziway, there are the huge investment projects, especially owned by the foreigners like the Netherlands and the France, like the floriculture industries and the wine factories. And on top of this, again, the lake supports the livelihoods of many local people, especially fisheries and their wives and children, especially engaged in the fish processing and selling. Therefore, the lake supports a variety of livelihood means. In general, the lake is a major source of fishes in the country, and again, it is the permanent source of water for irrigation that's going on around the area. And again, it is used as a source of water for domestic as well as livestock uses. However, the area is now experiencing different challenges because of the increasing of the human population, and along with the increasing of urban areas, and again, the establishment of different types of industries, especially the agro-processing industries. And the area is also considered as one of the important, economic development corridors, where there are different types of industries and small to large scale irrigations for fruits, vegetables, and flower farms. So that this needs much attention in order to use sustainably for the wise use of these resources.
As far as the Ethiopian case is concerned, the serious problem is the forest degradation, which is a cause for other environmental problems as well. When you see that the biodiversity loss is directly related with that of the forest cover loss. Before century, we had about 47% of forest cover at the national level. Now this forest is depleted through time, and it is now less than about 15% of the forest cover is left. And even this 15% is the changing the meaning of the forest aspects by including that the woodland as well as the shrubs to that of the forest concepts. That's the most important point. So this forest degradation by itself creates a significant impact for soil degradation as well, because the bare land is exposed for heavy erosion. Ethiopia gets a huge amount of rainfall during its summer season, so that huge amount of rainfall, huge amount of soil is eroded and gone down to that out of the country through that of the big rivers and long rivers. That's also the most important point. And through this forest degradation aspects, also the biodiversity loss is also the most serious problem. Ethiopia is a home of diverse biological organisms, both plants and animals, but if the forest is degraded, that causes animals and the plants are also, biodiversity are also in very big problems. And the other point is that of the climate variability is also a serious problem, which might be also the impact of that of the global warming effects and the global climate change effects. There is a climate variability everywhere, and that of the in rainfall or other aspects. And I think all these things are directly related with that of the deforestation and forest cover as an umbrella losses in the environmental concerns.
Okay. On top of this, I mean, water pollution is one of the environmental issues in Ethiopia. The water quality deterioration is happening due to the increasing of the agrochemicals runoff, especially agricultural lands. And land use, land coverage changes is happening at fast rate, and this has also brought enormous erosion and land degradations in the country. And here, with respect to the agricultural runoff and the occurrence of water hyacinths, especially on the major lake in Ethiopia, is now currently happening. And due to the nutrient enrichment or eutrophications, then previously we have not yet, experiencing the water hyacinths. Nowadays, water hyacinths are expanding in the major Ethiopian lakes. Therefore, this is one of the major problems now we are facing in the country. And the other major problem in Ethiopia is now, especially in the urban areas, in the urban environment, the major problem is proper soil waste management. Is the major issues, just like the other developing countries. But in general, the major causes for these environmental challenges are of many factors, and the major one is population increase, can be considered as one of the major problems. And as I said earlier, land use, land cover changes can also be taken as one of the factors, and pollutions. And again, unsustainable utilization of resources, like overharvesting of resources, can also be the factors, and the invasive alien species like the water hyacinths and some others are also invading the agricultural lands. This can be taken as one of the problems. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and for me, I won't really speak for Cape Town, because Cape Town is it's not really representative of South Africa. So I can speak mostly of South Africa, but South Africa is also quite different because it's a very diverse country. So we call ourselves a rainbow nation, not just because we are rainbow from a demographic point of view, but also from a landscape point of view, an environmental point of view. So we have a lot of biomes in South Africa. So you have wetlands, you have grasslands and forests and so on. So depending on where you are, you can talk about different kinds of environmental issues. But I will just speak about the more overarching ones that I feel affect a lot of people. So rainfall variability will be one big issue that's been experienced in different parts of the country. So some parts of the country on the east, for instance, have experienced a lot of flooding over the past 5 years. And then in the western part of the country, there's been a lot of droughts. So Cape Town, for instance, had a famously publicized droughts over the past 3 years. We almost approached what was called day zero, when there was a scare of, the government was going to cut out all the water because, we were basically running out. So luckily there was some rain that came right at the brink of day zero. So it's been an ongoing problem in different parts of the country. And then wildlife poaching is also a big problem in South Africa, especially rhino poaching that's been happening in a lot of nature reserves. It's not clear who's responsible, but it's been happening, and it's not clear why it's not being regulated. Overfishing is also a big problem in South Africa. So you have this squabble between small-scale fishers, which are mostly the poorer people in rural areas where I work, and you also have a huge industrial fisheries sector in South Africa that's bringing in a lot of money that contributes to the economy. So those guys are not being regulated as much by the government compared to. So the government puts a lot of effort on regulating small-scale fisheries, but those fisheries activities don't really put a lot of strain on marine resources because of the type of technology that's used compared to large-scale industrial fisheries. So as I said before, our problems are mostly related to governance issues that we have, and our government focuses a lot on neoliberal how can I put it? It's mostly our conservation interventions are more neoliberally driven. So rather than caring about the environment, which is what a lot of people are concerned about. So for instance, one of the biggest things that South Africa is doing is looking at how to exploit our oceans to contribute to the economy, something called the blue economy. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. So there's a lot of talks about offshore mining in the oceans to mine for oil and gas, and that obviously will have implications on offshore fisheries and other types of minerals that are found offshore. So there are a lot of ecological concerns, but the government is focusing more on what kind of economic gains that could bring to our economy. So I think that's one of the biggest issues. I work a lot in the marine environment, so we have something in fisheries called SASSI, which is South African Sustainable Seafood Initiative. So basically what it is it promotes sustainability of fisheries, not only from the people that sell the fish, but also from a consumer's point of view. So as a consumer, when you go into a restaurant and they serve you tuna or salmon, you can know that actually you shouldn't be serving this fish because it's not sustainable. So SASSI generates a list which has red, green, and yellow, which basically indicates to everyone in the nation which fish they shouldn't be purchasing from the shops. So that really helps with keeping the fisheries industry accountable, basically, to what's sustainable to harvest and what's not sustainable to harvest. So that's called SASSI. And that has resulted in a spin-off of other eco-friendly policies that have come up. So we have, for instance, now an app called Abalobi, which is basically a link to SASSI. And this one, what it does is, because there are a lot of people that fish because they are poor, but they don't have legal rights to fish. So this app basically does the same thing. When you go to a restaurant, you can check on the app where the fish that you're eating came from. So even if it didn't come from industrial fisheries, if it came from a certain community, you can actually know who in that community harvested it. But one of the other biggest ones is also fair trade. So we have fair trade certification in South Africa, and a lot of that is on coffee. And so it doesn't come from South Africa, but for instance, like Ethiopia actually is probably the biggest producer of coffee in Africa. So what the Fair Trade Initiative does is that when Ethiopian coffee comes to South Africa, they sell it at a fair price to make sure that the farmers in Ethiopia are getting what they deserve. And actually, there's a very interesting documentary that I'm not sure if you guys have seen it called, I think it's called Black Gold. And it's about coffee production in Ethiopia and how farmers are getting paid next to nothing for the coffee that they harvest. And big companies such as Starbucks and Nestle take that coffee and they sell it for huge profits in the US and in Europe. So the Fair Trade Initiative basically tries to sort of level the scales and to make sure that because farmers in Africa, because of World Trade Organization regulations, are not subsidized by their governments, it's very difficult for them to survive. So they end up producing a lot of agricultural produce and they sell it to the developed world, but they get next to nothing for it. So South Africa takes fair trade policies very seriously. So we do sell fair trade coffees, and in tourism as well, we have something called fair trade tourism, where the government has come up with certain principles that tourism companies need to follow if they are operating in, those wilderness areas where you go to those lodges and you want to escape. So sometimes people go to those kind of places and they think, oh, I'm one with like your Yellowstones and in areas like that, but you don't really think about how people were displaced so that could be built. So fair trade tourism is basically about making sure that if you are operating in those kind of environments, you are aware of the people that are less fortunate that live around that establishments and that they get to benefit. So either you employ them or maybe you share the profits of your, but it's not obviously forced onto companies, but if you do practice that, then you can either you get certified, and it's basically, it's also called corporate social responsibility, which I think exists in many countries like the US. But South Africa tries to do better at corporate social responsibility by setting standards and making sure that they follow through.
Concerning the environmental policy in Ethiopia, I think Ethiopia, is having now federal states, and therefore the environmental policy in Ethiopia involves all the federal and the regional states to protect the environment and conserve the national resources that we have. And this policy of Ethiopia, includes also sectoral policies, and the sectoral policies are there, in order to address the soil issues, and sustainable agriculture, and the forest issues, the woodlands, the tree resources, the plantations, and the biodiversity issues, the energy resources, the main ones, and the water resources, the mineral resources, the human settlement, especially the urban environment, and so on. Therefore, Ethiopia has been implementing sustainable development, especially what we call it the green economy, and this is eco-friendly technologies, especially in the energy sector. Therefore, the energy sector consists of the renewable energy resources, like the hydro, the wind, and the geothermals. Now, Ethiopia is now having these types of renewable energy resources. Therefore, the country is now mainly focusing on, especially on the hydroelectric energy generations. At larger scale, now the government is focusing on the hydroelectric generation. Therefore, as to me, this can be implemented cheaply as well as easily in the US to help reduce emissions and play a role to fight and alleviate the climate impacts globally.
The public support of policies is mainly accepted if the public is involved in the policy formulation as well as implementation processes. And there is a gap of involving the local community when policies are formulated in different contexts. That's why that many of the conservation structures, which were started in the 1970s, are not still successful to conserve the soil, the forest, and other resources. The farmers or the local communities should own those policies and the strategies which are implemented for the sake of environmental and resource conservation. Otherwise, they can even this practice. We saw in our history also that during that of the previous government, there was huge mass plantation in the country. But after a time when the government is changing, in the transition period, huge amount of forest is cut by the farmers because they are not convinced, they were not convinced by the government to plant and how they can also be benefited. That's the most important point. So the public support comes by participating the public itself in the conservation activities. Otherwise, they might be aware of that concept. That's my point. Yeah, it's an important and interesting question. In the very beginning, that these agroforestry practices are not introduced practices. They are traditional agroforestry practices by some studies. And the implementation of agroforestry practices in the Ethiopian context is even older than the name agroforestry itself. And farmers either had a long experience and tradition of living trees in their annual crop areas and grazing lands. And the improvements through time are also coming due to that the experiences they had, not the other things. There are modern type of agroforestry practices introduced to the area. Farmers themselves, they are improving through time. Even though the majority of the households in my area are implementing agroforestry practices in all of those plots, there are few farmers who are not implementing as well. And there are different factors for this actually, and the farmers believe that it might take space for the annual crops, and they wanted to feed their family by growing short annual crops and harvested annually. And on the other hand, there is also a free grazing problem to plant trees and to leave trees on their cropland, especially which is far away from the homestays. If there's a free grazing, you can plant trees away from you rather than you can plant some trees around your home and you can protect them from these free grazing activities. The other major problem is related to that of security, land tenure security, which is a very important concept here. And the long-term investments, either in agroforestry, tree planting, or conservation activities, can be secured if farmers themselves, the land is filtered, their own land. And that cannot be taken by any other person or the government in the area. And in my watershed, one of the major problems is this tenure security problem because our land policy is declaring that the land is the owned by the government and the people of Ethiopia as a whole. So this ownership and tenure security is also a serious problem in the watershed area and in every other areas, including conservation activities in the different parts of Ethiopia. So I can say that there are no opposition for these activities since they themselves introduce these practices and they are the owner of those practices in the watershed.
Well, this is a good question for me. Therefore, our government should do enough for us to protect the lake. I mean, the initiative should come from the government because it is the public property. And therefore, first, there should be buffer zone establishment for the lake. There should be buffer zone establishment as a first step, so that any investment projects should not be allowed around the lake areas or in the vicinity of the lake. This should be the first. This should be the first concept. And second, there must be strict control on the treated waste disposal directly to the lake, because there are some investment projects around the lake, industries, hotels, something like that, so that these industries and hotels are directly discharging their wastes to the lake. Therefore, there must be treatment of wastewaters before directly discharging to surrounding areas, including the lake, and this must also be considered. And thirdly, there must also be strict control and follow-up over the unlimited water abstractions, because water is free, the public properties, therefore everyone can abstract for irrigation, for road constructions, for floriculture industries, for everything. And therefore, this must be restricted, just in order to keep the water balance of the lake, and again to ensure its sustainability. And there must also be proper and sustainable watershed management in the area to protect the lake from siltation and nutrient enrichment due to the agricultural runoff and other pollutions. Therefore, watershed management must also be considered as an important measures. And there must also be control on fishermen and their gill nets towards addressing overharvesting of fish, as Philile said earlier. The case in South Africa, this is small scale, fisheries. Therefore, everybody, there is no any control on the gill nets. Therefore, it is unproductive. They harvest everything. Therefore, that is not, the wise use of the lake, the fishery resources. There must also be control on these issues. But in general, to minimize the anthropogenic pressures on Lake Ziway and to ensure the lake sustainability toward supporting the livelihoods of local people, participatory action is needed by involving different government bodies in the area, by involving non-governmental organizations as development partners, and by involving local and international investors who are working around the area, by also involving the irrigation users, by also involving school children, high schools, especially high schools, and also the universities around there. And again, as in general, the local communities. All this should be involved as major actors, to protect the lake and to ensure its sustainability. And finally, I also recommend, the awareness creations and public sensitization on the value of the lake as resources and its conservations. This should also be mandatory. Shortly, I recommend all this just in order to ensure the sustainability of the lake and again to ensure the livelihoods of the poor local communities who are basing their livelihoods on the lake.
I think in South Africa it's quite the opposite. We have that. There's actually probably more protection for lakes or natural environments than people. But and that is seen through. So as I said, South Africa has a very high conservation target. But the problem is that a lot of conservation areas in South Africa, like the ones we're talking about, occur adjacent to where rural people are. And rural people have always been marginalized since apartheid and the colonial era. So then it creates that tension between rural development and conservation. Although the government puts a lot of effort in enforcing conservation, most of the time at the expense of people. So that's a very big problem that South Africa faces, where this balance between conservation. So conservation is always seen as anti-people. And there's this assumption that poor people are going to deplete everything, which is not necessarily true, because in my research I talk about customary use of natural resources, where for a long time, predating the colonial era, people have always had ways of interacting with like lakes and rivers in a way that was mutually it was a mutual relationship. But then what during the colonial and apartheid eras, because those were segregationist regimes, they separated people from nature. So even this idea of conservation, which started at Yellowstone National Park, was this idea that because it was during the industrial time, people had sort of destroyed a lot of trees and everything, and they felt like they needed to preserve some part of nature to go into when they felt they needed to escape. So that's where the idea of conservation first came from. So, but in a lot of global South country context, like in Africa, South America, Asia, a lot of people will tell you that they don't see themselves as separate from nature. But what conservation did is by creating fences and borders, it kicked people out. And I have really interesting examples in South Africa where people used to, hippos living in a lake. People used to have an understanding with hippos. They used to coexist with hippos. So when people planted crops, hippos knew instinctively not to go with people because they saw each other every day. But when the conservation government came in and they kicked people out and they put a fence, now hippos are no longer used to see people. So when they see people, they attack them. When people try to plant something, hippos will go in because I have a lot of interesting oral histories from different parts of South Africa about that. In the area where I was going to talk about my research in a UNESCO World Heritage site, where when the site was established, it was like, this is only for the environment, no people. Yeah. So the managers of the site are trying as hard as possible to kick people out. And now, because these are rural areas, people don't have jobs. The government is not investing enough. Like I was talking about the conservation being prioritized over rural developments. Government is not building schools. They're not doing it. So what are people going to do? So obviously they don't want to exploit resources, but they don't have a choice. And this for me is the biggest problem.